What's up fellas, Moon here. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to be talking about the healer role when it comes to World of Warcraft PvP, and I'm going to be giving you an honest look at the healer role as a whole, digging a little bit into the depth of what your responsibilities are as a healer and what the pros and cons are of playing a healer. And this is from the perspective as a healer myself, so it may be a little bit biased, but I'll try to keep it as fair as possible. So let's jump right into it. The first thing that I want you to know about healing is that it does differ between battlegrounds and arenas, mainly due to the number of healers that will be on your team. In a normal random battleground or a battleground blitz setting, you're going to have one other healer playing alongside you, so there's 2 per team. In a rated battleground setting where there is a 10v10 mode, there will be 3 healers on each team, so you have 2 people healing beside you. And when you are in the arena, you will be the only healer on your team. Because of this, your responsibilities will change a little bit, and you will either have more or less things to juggle, depending on what you're playing. So, universally, what are you doing as a healer? What are your main roles and responsibilities? Obviously, the first thing is keeping your team alive, making sure their health bar doesn't hit 0 by using healing spells. That's a sort of big duh moment, we all know this, so I'm not going to be focusing as much on that in particular. But on top of using your healing spells to keep your team alive, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be keeping your DPS players aggressive. Because if your DPS players can be aggressive, and the longer time they spend getting to DPS the enemy, your chances of winning any given match goes up. How do you do this? Every healer class, regardless of what healer specialization you play, has this thing called a dispel. It is on a 8-second cooldown, and it can be used to break certain crowd control on your DPS. Things such as Polymorph, Hammer of Justice, Freezing Trap, etc. can all be negated if you can catch it soon enough. For me to catch the abilities that I can dispel a little bit easier, I use a add-on called Big Debuffs. Again, that's Big Debuffs, and it's going to be spelled out as one word. You can find it on CurseForge. But that makes it to where there is a large icon on the player's raid frame whenever they're stuck in crowd control. That lets me know I can easily dispel them. So your bread and butter, regardless of if you're healing in battlegrounds or arena, is going to be 1, keeping your team alive, and 2, keeping your DPS aggressive. Something else I should mention too is that if another healer gets crowd controlled, for instance if you're in a rated battleground or battleground scenario, I would personally prioritize dispelling the other healers as well, just so that your other healers can use their dispels on the DPS, multiple healing cooldowns can be pressed, you're overall alleviating the pressure that is put on your team. As the game largely revolves around cooldown trading, so trading your offensive cooldowns for defensive cooldown, your overall role when it comes to how you fit on a team is more like a goalie, where you have by far some of the most powerful defensive cooldowns, but you really don't have any offensive cooldowns. So when you're on an arena team and you're playing with 2 other people in voice chat, you are juggling and rotating through all of your team's defensive cooldowns and alternating it with your own to where that you're juggling enough of your defensive cooldowns to survive the opposing team's damage. The next 2 things I'm going to be talking about are going to be specific for arena gameplay. The first of which is going to be assisting with setups. So a general concept in Arena is a setup is used in a literal sense where you are setting up a win condition using crowd control and damage for your team to get a kill attempt on the enemy team. Often this involves putting the enemy team in crowd control, and so as a healer you're generally going to be crowd controlling the off target, which is the DPS player that is not being killed. You can try to crowd control the enemy healer, but it's generally risky to do, putting yourself out in the open, and sets you up to be crowd controlled yourself. So assisting with setups will be this responsibility that is tacked on top of everything else we've previously discussed. Additionally, depending on which class you play, you are also going to be responsible for team utility and disruption. What categorizes as utility or disruption? Think of spells such as slows, such as roots, the little minor crowd control spells, or spells that help your team in a way that's not directly associated with damage. So, for instance, shamans have access to Grounding Totem, which is a totem they can place down that will absorb casts within the area for 3 seconds. Additionally, something that can be categorized as utility would be an offensive dispel, which would be a purge. At least in the context of healers, you will see priests and shamans have this type of dispel, and a disruption ability would be something like an interrupt. If you are a newer healer to the game, this sounds like a lot to deal with, and it is. So how we go about this is taking 1 step at a time, which in my opinion, would be your healing and keeping your DPS aggressive with good dispels, you can tack on the rest of the stuff as you get more comfortable with the game. If you just learn juggling overnight, you're not going to start juggling with 5 balls. You're going to start with 2 and then move on to 3 when you're ready, and then add a 4th when it makes sense. Same concept here. Now, I want to go over some pros and cons to the healer role. Some pros that I've experienced is that you get quick queues. Everybody knows this. Solo shuffle is not inherently great as a healer, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But because so few people actually play this role, you will get queues that are generally under 2 minutes in length, if not instantaneous. This means you just get more raw repetitions at the game, and if you're somebody who maybe doesn't care what role you play a little bit, and just wants to play the damn game, or you only have an hour a day, you really don't want to spend 30 minutes of that hour waiting in queue, you can just jump right into a game and start playing. If you don't use the queuable game mode and you decide to do something more along the lines of LFG, you'll notice that it'll be easier to make friends as well, because a lot of players, even higher rated ones, would be willing to play with a lower rated healer due to how few healers there are in the game. This can be fantastic for making friends who are better at the game than yourself, as they'll often have wisdom and tips that can help fast track your improvement with the game. Most healers can actually play with most classes in the game too, so you don't have to worry about compositions as much, but I will say that depending on which healing class you play, it will set you up to play with certain compositions better. I'll give you 3 examples right here. Both of the priest specializations generally do exceptionally well when they are playing in a setup composition, because their defensive capabilities and crowd control, along with their utility, best suits that type of composition. A restoration shaman would be very good with melee cleave compositions that are very rushdown oriented, because the restoration shaman is a momentum based healer that has a lot of utility and a lot of disruption, which can keep their melee as aggressive as possible. And a restoration druid is generally best suited to heal caster compositions, because their healing over time abilities allow them to make one of the casters essentially immortal as long as they're maintaining it. And even though a druid's mana bar tends to be its weakness, the casters can create room for the druid to constantly sneak out and in, getting drinks and refilling its mana. You generally won't have a ton of classes that you cannot play with, and even though I gave examples just now of compositions that healers would be best suited to heal, you can still heal pretty much anything. And the last pro about playing a healer is that they're exceptionally effective in battlegrounds. More often than not, having good healers can turn the tides as to if you'll win or lose a battleground, and really there's only a few roles that I would say trump the healer role. I would argue that rogue and maybe the flag carrier would be the 2 that come to mind for me, but due to the lack of the dampening mechanic, which is a stacking healing reduction in battlegrounds, a healer is able to keep their team alive to the extent of their skill and their mana bar. So now that we went over some of the pros of being a healer, let's go over some of the cons. The biggest con that comes to mind for me is that healers generally take a lot more time to pick up and do well with, as they require a lot more base game knowledge than a DPS class would. This means that you have to be more familiar with the types of crowd control that other classes can do, because it's more often than not going to end up on you, as well as knowing what your own teammates' defensive capabilities are so that you can alternate your cooldowns with theirs to be able to live longer. The second con that comes to mind is that your mistakes are very visible. If a mage uses alter time and it's a very bad usage of alter time and he drops to low hit points, the DPS players aren't going to notice that. But if you don't press your CC break trinket at the right time, or you're not able to swap your heals over to the right target fast enough, that target's going to die and you're going to lose the game. Everybody's going to know that you made a mistake. And so another thing that comes up that is very frustrating to deal with as a healer is that your teammates, you can generally compensate for their mistakes by trading a little bit more mana or trading an additional healing cooldown early. But because your mistakes are more visible, you will sometimes get blamed for your teammates' mistakes, even though it was not directly your fault. That is just something that happens as a healer player. A lot of the DPS players that I know also happen to play healers, so they really don't have that mentality as much. But my personal advice would be to stay away from Demon Hunter players if you can help it. Third con of being a healer in the arena sense or solo shuffle is the dampening mechanic, which is again a stacking healing reduction debuff that applies every so often. In solo shuffle, I believe it starts at a certain percentage and then it just instantaneously starts going up. Whereas in the 3v3 mode itself, start at a base of, I believe, 10%, and then at the 5-minute mark, it starts to ramp up from there. While Dampening can be a good thing for healers because a exceptional healer can be able to last long into dampening and keep their team alive in the early game when dampening's not really much of a factor. You do fall off in the late game, and at some point the responsibility falls on yourself to get the right crowd control, but mainly your DPS to actually close out the kill. The fourth con is that you are limited by mana, which is why it is also important, on top of your other responsibilities that I've mentioned earlier in the video, to maintain your mana well. The only way that you can regain mana as a healer is if you drop combat, which is to not hit anyone, not heal anyone for 7 seconds. And then you can sit down and begin to restore your mana. This can be difficult to execute on top of the other responsibilities I've mentioned earlier. An exceptional healer will be able to manage their mana well by using lower cost, more efficient healing spells, and then going for drinks a little bit earlier on before it becomes absolutely dire for the healer to try and regain mana. And the last con about healing is that you are crowd controlled a lot. In World of Warcraft PvP, the general consensus of how to most effectively win the game is to kill a DPS player while crowd controlling the enemy healer. So as a result, you will find yourself having to operate in short windows when you are on the diminishing return of crowd control. And while a good bit of crowd control is avoidable, if the enemy team is going out of their way to crowd control you, they're eventually going to land it. So it is something that you do have to consider when you pick up the healer role. So this is my breakdown of healing in World of Warcraft PvP and my thorough analysis of it. How do I personally feel about it? I have this really strange love-hate relationship with healing. I didn't initially want to heal. I only really did it because I didn't have a ton of friends that played WoW at the time, and I wanted a quick method of making connections. But I sort of fell in love with the healer role as a whole because it allowed me to be a shot caller. It allowed me to learn the game in a more in-depth lens as well, and it does feel fulfilling keeping your team alive through some really insane situations. So as much as I want to try and deny myself as a healer main and try and say, oh, I'm going to be a frost mage main and everything like that, I think I will still be healing for the rest of my time playing this game to some degree, because of one, how few healers there are. Being an exceptional healer, be recognized as a good healer, it means a lot. So I think that even though there are a ton of cons, and don't even get me started on the cons of healing in solo shuffle, a lot of those can be overlooked if you are making those connections, if you are making friends in the game, and you are having a fun time playing with them. So that is my breakdown of the healer role in World of Warcraft. Tell me what y'all think in the comments down below, if you would consider trying healing, if you are a healer yourself, what your experiences have been. But that'll do it for today's video. If you like this form of content, it would mean a lot if you could help me out by subscribing, liking the video, engaging, you know the drill. And until next time, this is Moon, signing out.